My name is Chris Fulp, and I work with the King Public Library with the adult programs. I wanted to talk to you today about birds for the adult story time that is part of our summer learning program. Our summer learning program is in progress now and is available for all ages, including adults. For the adults, we have several different programs planned that will be all virtual. And we also have reading logs available and packets at the King Public Library. And for prizes this year, we have several things that are in the display window. Like I said before, this is a video for our summer learning program for adults that is a story time about birds. So what I would like to do today is talk a little bit about birds, but also read a couple of excerpts from books that are all available either through King Public Library or through our Cardinal system that we can get ordered in for people. So, birds are fascinating. There are around 10,000 living species on the planet today. They are on all 7 continents. They range in size from 2 inches or so for the bee hummingbird, all the way up to over 9 feet for an ostrich. There are birds that can swim and dive in the ocean as far deep as 900 feet. And there are birds that can go up to 240 miles per hour, which is just incredible. The birds we have living today are thought to be evolved from a fossil that was found in China that was from 160 million years ago of the Archaeopteryx. It was a feathered dinosaur who could possibly fly, but more probably glided. But birds are also in danger, and that means that with human activity, we are threatening about 1,200 bird species with extinction, and already 120 to 130 have already gone extinct due to human activity since the 17th century, which is just an insane amount. But bird watching has really taken off and is actually being very helpful to the conservation of birds. And I think that is really important. So birds are often social, and they use visual signals as well as songs and bird calls and dances, and they gather together in huge masses in flocks, and they oftentimes migrate, especially for breeding purposes. And they are just a wonderful group of animals. And so I'd like to read a couple of things about them and let you know what kind of books are available about them. So, one of the books I'd like to talk to you today about is The Falcon Thief, A True Tale of Adventure, Treachery, and the Hunt for the Perfect Bird by Joshua Hammer. It was published in 2020 by Simon & Schuster, and it is a book about a true crime story about the black market and a bird thief. And I think that's really fascinating that we can have a true crime story that is action-packed and a thriller and is also incredibly true. So I'm going to start today and just read you the prologue from The Falcon Thief by Joshua Hammer. Shortly after New Year's Day in 2017, I was on vacation with my family in England when I happened to pick up a copy of the Times of London. A short article buried inside the newspaper caught my eye. "Thief who preys on falcon eggs is back on the wing," declared the headline. The report by the Times crime correspondent John Simpson described a notorious wild bird trafficker who had jumped bail and disappeared in South America. He has dangled from helicopters and abseiled down cliffs in search of falcon eggs for wealthy Arab clients. Now, the international egg thief is on the wing again after the authorities in Brazil admitted that they had lost him. Jeffrey Lindrum, 55, slipped the net after being caught with 4 albino falcon eggs stolen from Patagonia and jailed for more than 4 years. He is said to pose a serious threat to falcons in Britain and beyond. The story of the egg thief grabbed my attention. The notion that there was a lucrative black market for wild birds' eggs seemed fairly ridiculous to me, like some wacky quest out of Dr. Seuss's Scrambled Eggs for Supper, which I'd read aloud many times over the course of a decade to my 3 boys. I'd never considered that obtaining the world's most valuable eggs would require dangerous, logistically complex missions to the most remote corners of the planet. What kind of character would make a living that way? Was Lindrum one oddball or a part of a whole hidden industry? Always a little skeptical of tabloid hype, I also wondered how much of a threat to endangered raptors Lindrum really posed. I tore out the clipping and started making casual inquiries when I got home. As I found myself falling deeper into the life of Geoffrey Lindrum, discovering his childhood fascination with falcons and his compulsive tree climbing and nest raiding, something not altogether unexpected happened. I began to notice birds. That spring I traveled to southern Wales with 2 officers from the Great Britain's National Wildlife Crime Unit to search for peregrine falcons and their eyries in the cliffs of the Rhoda Valley. Later that summer, on a magazine assignment in the marshes of southern Iraq, I threaded through the canals in a motorboat, acutely attuned to the avian life around me. Pied kingfishers, little black and white birds with needle-sharp beaks started out of the reeds as our craft sped past. A sacred ibis with enormous tipped white wings and a scythe-like black bill skimmed the surface of the marsh. I reread My Bird Problem, a 2005 New Yorker essay in which Jonathan Frasnin describes how his early birdwatching forays had heightened his excitement about venturing into the wild and encountering nature's breathtaking diversity. A glimpse of dense bush or a rocky shoreline gave me a crush-like feeling, a sense of the world's being full of possibility. He wrote, there were new birds to look for everywhere. It wasn't only the rare ones that caught my eye. In April 2018, I returned from one of my last field research trips about the falcon thief to discover my 5-year-old son in a state of high excitement. By a remarkable coincidence, a pair of common pigeons had built a nest on the bathroom window ledge of a third-floor apartment. For a month, as I wrote about the breeding behavior of birds in the wild and excavated the story of Lindrum's transformation from an adolescent nest raider to an international outlaw, I found regular inspiration looking at the ledge, easily visible across the courtyard from our kitchen window, watching the pigeon incubate her eggs, observing the tiny down-covered chicks as they huddled beneath their mother and grew in 2 weeks into awkward fledglings made Lindrum's crimes more vivid to me, and more outrageous. The bird-watching urge was proving irresistible. On Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts the next summer, I followed a kayak and a pair of regal ruffle-headed ospreys circling high above their man-made nest at the Long Point Wildlife Refuge, lost myself in a canoe for an hour among honking, socializing Canadian geese on Chilmark Pond, admired a red-tailed hawk soaring above the dunes at Great Rock Bridge, and called my family outside to watch when an American robin briefly alit in our garden. And then, as I was writing this book in the fall, came the most serendipitous moment. Early one morning, I caught a flash of color just outside my office window in Berlin. A parakeet, an Australian parakeet, had landed on the ledge. Its brilliant green body and yellow head, illuminated by the morning sun, matched the changing leaves of the linden tree behind it. The bird must have escaped from somebody's cage and would soon be devoured by the predatory crows that stalk our neighborhood. 1 year earlier, I probably would have paid no attention to the sight, but now I called my partner excitedly, and we watched it together, exhilarated by the bird's vivid presence, aware of its near certain fate. The parakeet sat on the ledge for a good 2 minutes. Then it flew off, and, pursued by a sparrow, was swallowed up by the leaves of the linden tree. So, the falcon thief really shows how an individual can find one seemingly innocuous thing and become very interested in a specific topic, especially about birds. There's so many different things, and there's something that I think we recognize and we see every day, but we don't really spend a whole lot of time thinking about them more often than not. Bird watching has begun to be more popular, and it is through uses of books such as this one that you can start recognizing the birds that are around you. Field guides are extremely helpful for that, as they generally tell you what birds can be in your area and what birds you're more likely to see. Like, this one is specifically about the birds of the Carolinas. But there are ones just for North America, and then there's guides for all over the world. And you can really familiarize yourself with birds and get sucked into it. But the Falcon Thief is talking about something altogether different. It's talking a little bit about not only birds, but also the crimes associated with um, procuring rare species for independent individuals, as opposed to letting them live in the wild or in a sanctuary or something like that. And I think it is a very good tale that deals with a lot of action, and the fact that it's true means that it should be able to enrapture most people. And I think it's a very good, well written story that a lot of people would like, whether they're mystery readers or true crime enthusiasts, or simply want to know more about birds or nature itself. Another book I would like to talk about today is H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald, and it was published by Grove Press in 2014. It is also a true story and was written about a way of coping with grief through maybe doing something unexpected, such as raising and taming a ghost hawk. So I want to jump right into reading an excerpt from this one, and I'm just going to start right here at the very beginning of part 1 with Patience. 45 minutes northeast of Cambridge is a landscape I've come to love very much indeed. It is where wet fen gives way to parched sand. It's a land of twisted pines, burned out cars, shotgun peppered road signs, and the U.S. Air Force bases. There are ghosts here. Houses crumble inside numbered blocks of pine forestry. There are spaces built for air-delivered nukes inside greasy tumuli built behind 12-foot fences. Tattoo parlors and U.S. Air Force golf courses. In spring, it's a riot of noise, constant plane traffic, gas guns over pea fields, wood larks, and jet engines. It's called the Brecklands, the Broken Lands, and it is where I ended up that morning 7 years ago in early spring on a trip I hadn't planned at all. At 5 in the morning, I'd been staring at a square of streetlight on the ceiling, listening to a couple of late party leavers chatting on the pavement outside. I felt odd, overtired, and overwrought, unpleasantly like my brain had been removed and my skull stuffed with something like microwaved aluminum foil, dented, charred, and shorting out with sparks. Must get out, I thought, throwing back my covers. Out! I pulled on jeans, boots, and a jumper, scalded my mouth with burned coffee, and it was only when my frozen ancient Volkswagen and I were halfway down the A14 that I worked out where I was going and why. Out there, beyond the foggy windscreen and white lines, was the forest, the broken forest. That's where I was headed, to see ghost hawks. I knew it would be hard. Ghost hawks are hard. Have you ever seen a hawk catch a bird in your back garden? I've not, but I know it's happened. I've found evidence. Out on the patio flagstones sometimes, tiny fragments, a little insect-like sunburned leg with a foot clenched tight where the sinews have pulled it, or, even more gruesomely, a disarticulated beak, a house sparrow, beak top or bottom, a little conical bead of blushed gunmetal, slightly translucent with a few faint maxillary feathers adhering to it, but maybe you have. Maybe you've glanced out your window and seen there, on the lawn, a bloody great hawk murdering a pigeon, or a blackbird, or a magpie, and it looks the hugest, most impressive piece of wildness you've ever seen, like someone's tipped a snow leopard into your kitchen, and you find it eating the cat. I've had people rush up to me in the supermarket or in the library and say, "Eyes huge. I saw a hawk catch a bird in my back garden this morning." And I'm just about to open my mouth and say, "Sparrowhawk." And they say, "I looked in the bird book. It was a ghost hawk." But it never is. The books don't work. When it's fighting a pigeon on your lawn, or a hawk becomes much larger than life, and bird book illustrations never match the memory. Here's the sparrowhawk. It's gray with a black and white barred front, yellow eyes, and a long tail. Next to it is the goshawk. This one is also gray with a black and white barred front, yellow eyes, and a long tail. You think, You read the description. Sparrowhawk, 12 to 16 inches long. Goshawk, 19 to 24 inches. There, it was huge. It must be a goshawk. They look identical. Goshawks are bigger. That's all. Just bigger. No. In real life, goshawks resemble sparrowhawks the way leopards resemble house cats. Bigger, yes, but bulkier, bloodier, deadlier, scarier, and much, much harder to see. Birds of deep woodland, not gardens. They're the birdwatch's dark rail. You might spend a week in a forest full of gosses and never see one, just traces of their presence, a sudden hush followed by the calls of terrified wooden birds and a sense of something moving just beyond vision. Perhaps you'll find a half-eaten pigeon sprawled in a burst of white feathers on the forest floor, or you might be lucky. Walking in a foggy ride at dawn, you'll turn your head and catch a split-second glimpse of a bird hurtling past and away, huge talon feet held loosely clenched, eyes set on a distant target. A split second that stamps the image indelibly on your brain and leaves you hungry for more. Looking for goshawks is like looking for grace. It comes, but not often, and you don't get to say when or how, but you have a slightly better chance on still, clear mornings in early spring, because that's when goshawks issue their world under the trees to court each other in the open sky. That was what I was hoping to see. I slammed the rusting door and set off with my binoculars through a forest washed pewter with frost. Pieces of this place had disappeared since I was last here. I found squares of wrecked ground, clear-cut, broken acres with torn roots and drying needles strewn in the sand. Clearings. That's what I needed. Slowly my brain righted itself into spaces unused for months. For so long I've been living in libraries and college rooms, frowning at screens, marking essays, chasing down academic references. This was a different kind of hunt. Here I was a different animal. Have you ever watched a deer walking out from cover? They stop, and stay, motionless noise, nose to the air, looking and smelling. A nervous twitch might run down their flanks, and then, reassured that all is safe, they ankle their way out of the brushed graze. That morning, I felt like a deer. Not that I was sniffing the air or standing in fear, but like the deer, I was in a grip of very old and emotional ways of moving through a landscape, experienced forms of tension and deportment beyond conscious control. Something inside me ordered me how and where to step without me knowing much about it. It might be a million years of evolution, it might be intuition, but on my ghost hawk hunt, I felt tense. When I'm walking or standing in the sunlight, I find myself unconsciously edging towards broken light or slipping into the narrow, cold shadows along the wide breaks between pine stands. I flinch if I hear a jay calling or a crow's rolling angry alarm. Both of these things could mean either warning human or warning ghost hawk, and that morning I was trying to find one by hiding the other. Those old ghostly intuitions that have tied sinew and soul together for millennia had taken over, were doing their thing, making me feel uncomfortable in bright sunlight, uneasy on the wrong side of a ridge, somehow required to walk over the back of a bleached rise of grasses to get to something on the other side, which turned out to be a pond. Small birds rose up in clouds from the pond's edge. Chaffinches, bramblings, a flock of long-tailed tits that cawed in willow branches like animated cotton buds. The pond was a bomb crater, one of a line dropped by a German bomber over Laken Heath in the war. It was a watery anomaly, a pond and dune surrounded by thick tussocks of sand sedge many, many miles from the sea. I shook my head. It was odd, but then it's very odd indeed here. And walking the forest, you come across all sorts of things you don't expect. Great tracts of reindeer moss, for example, tiny stars and florets and inklings of an ancient flora growing on exhausted land. Crisp underfoot in summer, This stuff is like a patch of the Arctic fallen into the world in the wrong place. Everywhere there are bony shoulders and blades of flint. On wet mornings you can pick up shards knocked from flint cores by Neolithic craftsmen, tiny flakes of stone glowing in thin coats of cold water. This region was the center of the flint industry in Neolithic times, and later it became famous for rabbits farmed for meat and felt. And eventually the rabbits brought disaster. Their close grazing, in concert with that of sheep, reduced the short sward to a thin crust of roots over sand. Where the grazing was worse, and sand blew into drifts and moved across the land. In 1688, strong southwesterly winds raised the broken ground to the sky. A vast yellow cloud obscured the sun. Tons of land shifted, moved, dropped. Brandon was encircled by sand. Santon was engulfed, its river choked entirely. When the wind stopped, dunes stretched for miles between Brandon and Barton Mills. The area became famed for its atrociously bad travel. Soft dunes, scorching in summer and infested with highwaymen at night. Our very own Arabia Deserta. One John Evelyn described them as the traveling sands that so damaged the country, rowling from place to place like the sands in the deserts of Libya, quite overwhelmed some gentlemen's whole estates. Here I was, standing in Evelyn's traveling sands. Most of the dunes are hidden by pines. The forest was planted here in the 1920s to give us timber for future wars, and the highwaymen long gone. But it still feels dangerous, half buried, damaged. I love it because of all the places I know in England. It feels to me the wildest. It's not an untouched wilderness like a mountain top, but a ramshackle wilderness in which people and the land have conspired to strangeness. It's rich with the sense of an alternative countryside history, not just the grand leisure dreams of landed estates, but a history of industry, forestry, disaster, commerce, and work. I couldn't think of a more perfect place to find goshawks. They fit this strange Breckland landscape to perfection, because their history is just as human. It's a fascinating story. Goshawks once spread across the British Isles. There are diverse sorts and sizes of goshawks, wrote Richard Bloom in 1618, which are different in goodness, force, and hardiness according to several countries where they are bred, but no place affords so good as those of the Muscovy, Norway, and the north of Ireland, especially in the county of Tyrone. But the qualities of goshawks were forgotten when the advent of land enclosure, which limited the ability of ordinary folk to fly hawks, and the advent of accurate farms that made shooting, rather than falconry, high fashion. Goshawks became vermin, not hunting companions. Their persecution by gamekeepers was the final straw for a goshawk population already struggling from habitat loss. By the late 19th century, British goshawks were extinct. I have a photograph of the stuffed remains of one of the last birds to be shot, a black and white snapshot of a bird from a Scottish estate, draggled, stuffed, and glassy-eyed. They were gone. But in the 1960s and 1970s, falconers started a quiet, unofficial scheme to bring them back. The British Falconers Club worked out that for the cost of importing a goshawk from the continent for falconry, you could afford to bring in a second bird and release it. Buy one, set one free. It wasn't a hard thing to do with a bird as self-reliant and predatory as a gosh. You found a forest and opened the box. Like-minded falconers started doing this all over Britain. The hawks came from Sweden, Germany, and Finland. Most were huge, pale taiga forest goshes. Some were released on purpose. Some were simply lost. They survived, found each other, and bred, secretly and successfully. Today, their descendants number around 450 pairs, elusive, spectacular, utterly at home. The fact of these British goshawks makes me happy. Their existence gives the lie to the thought that the wild is always something untouched by human hearts and hands. The wild can be human work. It was 8:30 exactly. I was looking down at a little sprig of mahonia growing out of the turf, its oxblood leaves like puffed pigskin. I glanced up And then I saw my ghost hawks. There they were, a pair soaring above the canopy in the rapidly warming air. There was a flat, hot hand of sun on the back of my neck, but I smelt ice in my nose seeing those ghost hawks soaring. I smelt ice and bracken stems and pine resin. Ghost hawk cocktail. They were on the soar. Ghost hawks in the air are a complicated gray color. Not slate gray, nor pigeon gray, but a kind of rain cloud gray. And despite their distance, I could see the big powder puff of white under tail feathers fanned out with a thick, blunt tail behind it, and that superb bend and curve of the secondaries of a soaring ghost hawk that makes them utterly unlike sparrowhawks. And they were being mobbed by crows, and they just didn't care. Like, whatever. A crow barreled down on the male, and he sort of raised one wing to let the crow pass. Crow was not stupid, and didn't dip below the hawk for long. Those ghost hawks weren't fully displaying. There was none of the skydiving I read about in books, but they were loving the space between each other and carving it into all sorts of beautiful concentric chords and distances. A couple of flaps, and the male, the tiercel, would be above the female, and then he'd drift north of her, and then slip down fast like a knife cut, a smooth calligraphic scrawl underneath her, and she'd dip a wing, and then they'd soar up again. They were gone above a stand of pines, right there, and then they were gone. One minute my pair of ghost hawks was describing lines from physics textbooks in the sky, and then nothing at all. I don't remember looking down or away. Perhaps I blinked. Perhaps it was as simple as that. And in that tiny black gap which the brain disguises when they dived into the wood. I'd sat down, tired and content. The ghost hawks were gone, the sky blank. Time passed, the wavelength of the light around me shortened, the day built itself. A sparrowhawk, light as a toy of balsa wood and dulled tissue paper, zipped past at knee level, kidding up over a bank of brambles and away into the tree. I watched it go, lost in recollection. This memory was candescent, irresistible. The air reeked of pine resin and the patchy vinegar of wood oats. I felt my small girl fingers hooked through the plastic chain link and the weight of a pair of East German binoculars around my neck. I was bored. I was 9. Dad was standing next to me. We were looking for sparrowhawks. They nested nearby, and that July afternoon we were hoping for the kind of sighting they'd sometimes give us. A submarine rippled through the tops of the pines as one swept in and away, a glimpse of a yellow eye, a barred chest against moving needles, or a quick silhouette stamped black against the Surrey sky. For a while it had been exciting to stare into the darkness between the trees and the blood orange and black where the sun slapped crazy paving shadows across pines, but when you were 9, waiting is hard. I kicked at the base of the fence with my Wellingtoned feet, squirmed and fidgeted, let out a sigh, hung off the fence with my fingers, and then my dad looked at me, half exasperated, half amused, and explained something. He explained patience. He said it was the most important thing of all to remember. This, that when you wanted to see something very badly, sometimes you had to stay still, stay in the same place, remember how much you wanted to see it, and be patient. When I'm at work, taking photographs for the paper, he said, sometimes I've got to sit in the chair for hours to get the picture I want. I can't get up to get a cup of tea or even go to the loo. I just have to be patient. If you want to see hawks, you have to be patient too. If you want... He was grave and serious, not annoyed. What he was doing was communicating to a grown-up truth. But I nodded sulkily and stared at the ground. It sounded like a lecture, not advice, and I didn't understand the point of what he was trying to say. You learn. Today, I thought, not 9 years old and not bored. I was patient, and the hawks came. I got up slowly, legs a little numb for long, motionless, and found I was holding a small clump of rainwater moss in one hand, a little piece of that branching, pale green-gray lichen that can survive just about anything the world throws at it. It is patience made manifest. Keep reindeer moss in the dark, freeze it, dry it to a crisp. It won't die. It goes dormant and wait for things to improve. Impressive stuff. I waved the little twiggy sphere in my hand, hardly there at all, and on a sudden impulse I stowed this little stolen memento of the time I saw the hawks in my inside jacket pocket and went home. I put it on a shelf near the phone. 3 weeks later, it was the reindeer moss I was looking at when my mother called and told me that my father was dead. So, this is a really interesting book that deals with how we all interact with nature and how different humans can make different impacts. And she's talking in this book mostly about how she dealt with her father's death and the bereavement of that by rescuing a ghost hawk and training it. And it's fascinating and a very, very beautiful story. The writing in it is very detailed and is just something that I enjoy reading the descriptions. And I think it is a wonderful book. It has a little bit of self-help, but a lot of it is working with nature, and it's a human working with nature in order to persevere through their life. And I think that's important. She has obviously spent a lot of time around nature and looking for birds and being involved with looking and searching out ghost hawks, and took a long time in understanding what it takes to see them, but also what they are as compared to sparrowhawks. And I think that this is a very good book for people who want to learn more and who want to learn how maybe humans have affected the creatures. In this particular case, the original British ghost hawks were dealt extinction pretty much mostly by human actions, but it's also human actions that brought them back. And they might not be exactly the same birds, but I think it's interesting that it was human activity that did both. And her idea that wildness doesn't necessarily mean untouched by human hands is a very, very interesting idea. And I think that it is a wonderful concept and something that requires a lot more reading and thought. So I hope you enjoyed the excerpt from H is from Hawk. H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald. All right, thank you. So there are many different types of books about birds. There's informational and educational, and there's nonfiction essays and personal narratives that are oftentimes very beautiful and touching and very thoughtful. But there are also novels and short stories that deal with birds or use birds as part of a literary device. And there are local authors to North Carolina that have written books that interact with birds on one level or another. One of them would be When the Ravens Die by Cameron Kent, which is a wonderful book that was written in 2000 that was published in 2002 by Alliance Books, and it's set in Britain, and it's based off of the English legend of as long as there are ravens in the Tower of London, the monarchy will survive. And it's a wonderful book, and it's available for checkout at King Public Library. But there is another author who also is from North Carolina who wrote a book that's not about birds so much so as uses them, a specific bird, as a metaphor for the characters in the work, or one specific character. And that author is Ron Rash, and the book is called The Cove. And we also have a copy of this at King Public Library, but we can get it in for you as well. And it is a beautiful story written in 2012 by Ron Rash, or published in 2012 by Harper Collins, written by Ron Rash. And it is a fantastic story, and uses references to birds all the way through it. And I would like to read you an excerpt from this wonderful piece of Southern fiction. And I'm just going to start at chapter 1. It says, "At first, Laurel thought it was a warbler or a thrush, though unlike any she'd heard before. Its song more sustained, as if so pure no breath need carry it into the world. Laurel raised her hands from the creek and stood. She remembered the bird Miss Calicut had shown the class, a Carolina parakeet. Miss Calicut had said, and unfolded a handkerchief to reveal the green body and red and yellow head. Most parakeets live in tropical places like Brazil, Miss Calicut explained, but not this one. She led the students past the bird around the room, telling them to look closely and not forget what it looked like, because soon there'd be none left, not just in these mountains, but probably in the whole world. 16 years since then, but Laurel remembered the long tail and thick beak, how the green and red and yellow were so bright they seemed to glow. Most of all, she remembered how light the bird felt inside the handkerchief's cool silk, as if even in death retaining the weightlessness of flight. Sorry. Laurel couldn't remember if Miss Calicut described the parakeet's song, but what she heard now seemed a fitting match, pretty as the parakeets themselves. As Laurel rinsed the last soap from her wash, the song merged with the water's rhythm, and the soothing smell of rose pink and bee balm. She lifted Hank's army shirt from the pool and went to where the granite outcrop leaned out like a huge anvil. Emerging from the mountain's vast shadows was, as always, like stepping from behind a curtain. She winced from the sunlight, and her bare feet felt the strangeness of treading on a surface, not aslant. The granite was warm and dry, except on the far side where the water flowed, but even there the creek slowed and thinned, as if it too savored the light, and was reluctant to enter the Cove darkness. Laurel laid Hank's shirt near the edge and stretched out the longer right sleeve first, then the other. She looked around the bedraped granite, her wash like leavings from the stream's recent flooding. Laurel raised her chin and closed her eyes, not to hear the bird, but to let the sun immerse her face in a warm, waterless bath. The only place in the cove that she could do this, because of the outcrop wasn't dimmed by ridges and trees. Instead, the granite caught and held the sunlight. Laurel could be warm here, even with her feet numbed by creek water. Hank had built a clothesline in the side yard, but she didn't use it, even in winter. Clothes dried quicker in the sunlight, and they smelled and felt cleaner. Unlike the cove's depths, where clothes hung a whole day, retained a mildewed dampness. "They'll dry just as quick if I ain't watching," Laurel told herself and set down the wicker basket. She remembered how Becky Dobbins, a store owner's daughter, asked why the farmer killed such a pretty bird. "Because they'll eat your apples and cherries," Riley Watkins had answered from the back row. "Anyway, they're the stupidest thing you've ever seen," Riley added, and told how his daddy fired into a flock and the unharmed parakeets didn't fly away, but kept circling until not one was left alive. Miss Calicut had shaken her head. "It's not because they're stupid, Riley." Laurel followed the creek's ascent, stepping around waterfalls and rocks and felled trees when she had to, otherwise keeping her feet in water and away from any prowling copperhead or satinback. The land steepened and the water blurred white. Oaks and tulip poplars dimmed the sun, and rhododendron squeezed the banks tighter. Laurel paused and listened, the bird's call rising over the water's rush. "They never desert the flock," Miss Calicut had told them, and Laurel had never known it to be otherwise. On the rarer and rarer occasions the parakeet passed over the cove, they always flew close together. Sometimes they called to one another, a sharp cry of wee, 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 a cry, but not a song, because birds didn't sing while flying. The one time a flock lit in her family's orchard, the parakeets had no chance to sing. But this parakeet, if that's what it was, did sing, and it sang along. Laurel sidled around another waterfall. The song became louder, clearer, coming not from the creek, but near the ridge crest. As quietly as possible, Laurel left the water and made her way through trees twined with Virgin's Bower, and then into a thicket of rhododendron. Close now, the song source only a few yards away. On the thicket's outer side, sunlight fell through a breach in the canopy. Laurel crouched and moved nearer, pulled aside a last thick-leaved rhododendron branch. A flash of silvery flame caused her to scuttle back into the thicket, brightness pulsing from the back on the back of her eyelids. The song did not pause. She blinked until the brightness went away and again moved closer, no longer crouching but on her knees. Through a gap in the leaves she saw a haversack, then shoes and pants. Laurel lifted her gaze, her eyelids squinched to shutter the brightness. A man sat in his back against a tree, eyes closed as his fingers skipped across the silver flute, all the while his cheeks pursed and puffed, nostrils flaring for air. The man's blond hair was a greasy tangle, his whiskers not yet a full beard, but enough of one to, like his hair, snare dirt and twigs. Laurel let her gaze take in a blue chambray shirt, torn and frayed and missing buttons, the corduroy pants ragged as the shirt, and shoes whose true color was lost in a lathering of dried mud. Sunday shoes, not brogrands or top-overs. Except for the flute, whatever else the man possessed looked to be in the haversack. A circle of black ground and charred wood argued he'd been on the ridge at least a day. The song ended and the man opened his eyes. He set the flute across his raised knees and tilted his head as though awaiting a response to the song. Perhaps one he would not welcome, because he appeared suddenly tense. His eyes swept past Laurel, and she saw that no crow's feet crinkled the eyes, the brow and cheeks briar scratched but unlined. The eyes were the same blue as water in a deep river pool, the face long and thin, features more hewn than needed. Laurel tugged the muslin on her left shoulder closer to her neck. Then he closed his eyes again and pressed his lower lips to the metal, played something more clearly, a human song. Up this high, the rhododendron blossoms hadn't fully wilted. The rich perfume and the vanilla smell of the Virgin's Bower made Laurel lightheaded as minutes passed and one song blended into another. The sun leaned west, and what light the gap in the trees allowed sifted away. The flute's sparkling silver muted to gray, but the music retained its airy brightness. It felt like she listened only a few minutes. But when Laurel got back to the outcrop, Hank's shirt was almost dry. She gathered the socks and step-ins, her other muslin work dress, and Hank's overalls. A purple butterfly lit on the stream edge to sip water. A pretty hue, most anyone would say, the same way they'd speak of church glass or bull thistle as pretty. Just not pretty on white skin, though she hadn't known the difference until first grade. When she was 8, the taunts had gotten so bad that she'd scrubbed the birthmark with lye soap until the skin blistered and bled. With that memory came another, of Jubal Parton. Laurel placed the one-wristed army shirt in the basket last, its damp shadow lingering on the granite. Up on the ridge, the music stopped. He could be coming down the creek, Laurel realized. Maybe glimpsed her through the trees. For the first time, she felt a shiver of fear. As beautiful as the music had been, the man's scratch-faced and tattered clothes argued trouble. Perhaps a tramp looking for a farmhouse to rob. Maybe do worse than just steal, she thought. Laurel looked towards the ridge and listened for the crunch of leaves. The only sound was the murmur of the stream. The music resumed, coming from the same place on the ridge. She pressed the wicker basket against her belly and made her way down the trail. The air grew dank and dark, and even darker as she passed through a stand of hemlocks. Toadstools and witch hazel sprouted on the trail edge. Further down, nightshade and the baneberry, whose poisonous fruit looked like a doll's eyes. 2 days' rain had made the woods proxy with mushrooms. The gray ones with the slimy feel of slugs were harmless, Laurel knew, but the larger, pale mushrooms could kill you, as could the brown, hooded kind that clumped on rotting wood. Chestnut wood, because that's what filled the understory more and more with each passing season. As Laurel approached her parents' grave, she thought of what she'd asked Slidell to do, what he said he'd do, though adding that at his age, such a vow was like snow promising to outlast spring. Laurel set the basket down and stood in front of the graves. One was 15 years old, the other less than a year. But the names etched on the soapstone had been likened to a similar gray-green smoothness. Laurel knew those who avoided this cove would see some further portent in such vanishing. but the barbed wire and colt and calves were portents too, good portents, though the best was Hank surviving the war when most people believed this place marked him for sheer death. But Hank hadn't died, missing a hand, but other men from outside the cove had fared far worse. But Hank hadn't died, missing a hand, but other men from outside the cove had fared much worse. Paul Clayton had been in a Washington hospital for 2 months, and Vince Ford and Wesley Ellenberg had come home in flag-draped coffins. Soon Hank was going to get married. Another good thing. It would be an adjustment deciding who cooked or who cleaned, who swept the floors or drew the water. There'd be times when she and Carolyn might get huffy with each other, but they'd figure it out. They'd become like sisters after a while. Carolyn was a reader, Hank had said, everything from her daddy's newspapers to books, so they'd have that in common. As Laurel left the woods, she saw Hank and Slidell stretching barbed wire in the upper pasture. 81, but Slidell tried to help Hank an hour or two each day. With so many men conscripted, hired hands were scarce. Those few around unwilling to work in the cove. Only Slidell would, and he refused money, only took an occasional favor in return. She watched as Hank set the wire in the crowbar's claw and pulled against the brace, enough strength garnered in that one arm and hand to stretch the strand tight as a fiddle string. Hank's right bicep was twice as big as the left, the forearm thick and ropey with blue veins that bulged with each pull. He was so much stronger than when he first returned from Europe, strong enough that even when armed, no one, including Jubal Parton, would want to cross him. Laurel stopped at the spring house and set a quart jar of sweet milk and cake of butter atop the clothes. Past time to start supper, but once on the porch she lingered and watched the men work. The pasture fence was nearly a quarter done, the wire strung and the locust post deep-rooted and straight. More proof to Carolyn's father, who sometimes watched from the notch head, that even with one hand Hank could support a wife and children. Hank remained tight-lipped about his exact plans, the way he was about a lot of things. The last month, Laurel had passed his room and seen him studying what their mother had called the wish book, a pencil in his hand. Later, she'd taken the thick catalog off of Hank's bureau and found the pages he corner-folded. Pencil stars marked a provider, 6-hole cast-iron range, golden age chiffonier, and a Franklin sewing machine. She'd been about to close the wish book when she saw another fold. This page showed a 3/4-carat diamond ring. Beside the words, must include ring size, Hank had written 6. Laurel went inside. She took a dough tray off its peg and set it on the cook's table. As she opened the mill gum and scooped out flour with a straight cup, Laurel debated whether to tell Hank and Slidell about the man with the flute. Decided not to. So that was an excerpt from Ron Rash's The Cove, and the mentioning of birds in it is spread throughout the whole of the story, and he uses the Carolina parakeet in it as a metaphor for the characters, but also specifically for Laurel. And it is a beautifully written piece of Southern fiction that is very, it can be a little heavy at times, but it is a very, very nice read. So I want to thank you for joining me today for the adult program of a adult story time for the summer learning program of King Public Library. I hope you will come in and we can discuss some of these books so we can get you some more in. There are many more where these came from, and the packets will have lists of books that involve birds and are both nonfiction and fiction, and we can get them in for you if they're available in the catalog. I'd really like to thank you for joining me and hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. And go outside and maybe enjoy some bird song along with reading a book. Thank you. Bye-bye.